The digital clock bled red into the darkness of the Gangnam penthouse. 3:12 a.m. in Woojin's world. A phone call at this hour usually meant a pier in Incheon had been raided or a lieutenant had turned. He didn't hesitate. He didn't breathe. He simply answered. He was a man who ruled the concrete veins of Seoul with a pulse of ice, a figure whose shadow alone could silence a nightclub. His empire was built on the certainty of his grip. But the voice on the other end wasn't the gravelly report of a bodyguard. It was a panicked nurse at Seoul National University Hospital. "Is this Young Woojin? You're the emergency contact for Shin Ara. She's in active labor. She's asking for you." The ice cracked. For the first time in years, the Emperor of Gangnam felt the air leave his lungs. He was moving before the nurse could finish the sentence. He didn't reach for his suit jacket. He reached for the surgical scrubs he kept for special disappearances, a disguise that would let him move through the sterile halls of SNU Hospital like a ghost. 7 months. That's how long the silence had lasted since the divorce papers were signed. 7 months of convincing himself that the betrayal which tore them apart was final. He had spent that time burying his humanity under layers of violence and territory wars, pretending he didn't wake up in the middle of the night reaching for the space where Ara used to sleep. The black sedan didn't just drive. It hunted through the empty Seoul streets. Outside, his silent bodyguards followed in a ghost convoy, their presence a dark perimeter against the rivals who would pay a king's ransom to see Woojin this desperate. As the modern glass of the hospital rose to meet him, Woojin's hands that had ordered executions and signed multi-billion-won deals, were trembling. He wasn't arriving as a boss. He was arriving as a man who had just realized he'd been living a lie, rushing toward a woman he still loved, and a child he never knew he had. The sterile, fluorescent hum of Seoul National University Hospital felt more hostile than any back-alley negotiation in Gangnam. Under the harsh white lights, Young Woojin was a ghost. He stood in a cramped, secondary locker room, the scent of antiseptic stinging his nostrils as he pulled the thin, teal fabric of surgical scrubs over his frame. The broad shoulders that usually filled a 5 million won charcoal suit were now hidden under the anonymity of a doctor's uniform. He adjusted the pleated mask over his face, leaving only his eyes visible, eyes that held a predatory intensity, now softened by a frantic, underlying terror. Outside the locker room door, the hospital corridor appeared normal to the untrained eye, but to Woojin it was a tactical map. 4 men in dark, understated suits stood at varying intervals along the hallway. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at one another. They were the silent perimeter, the human shield between the underground's most powerful man and the rival. Factions who would love nothing more than to catch him unarmed in a place of healing. A sharp nod from his lead enforcer, Kim, confirmed the floor was secure. Woojin moved with a practiced, steady gait, mimicking the exhausted pace of a surgeon on a double shift. His hand hovered over the Glock tucked into his waistband, a heavy weight against his hip, before he forced himself to let go. He couldn't be a monster tonight, not in front of her. As he approached room 428, the muffled sounds of the maternity ward, the rhythmic beep of monitors, the distant cry of a newborn, began to drown out the roar of his own heartbeat. He stopped at the heavy wooden door, his gloved hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. He had survived assassination attempts and corporate takeovers, yet the prospect of facing the woman he had let walk away 7 months ago made his knees weak. The silence of the hallway was thick, guarded by his men who watched the elevators like hawks. Woojin took one last breath of filtered air, pushed the door open, and stepped out of the shadows of his empire and into the light of the life he thought he had destroyed. The heavy door to room 428 clicked shut behind him, sealing out the sterile hum of the hospital and the silent, watchful eyes of his men. The air inside was warmer, thick with the scent of lavender and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. In the center of the room, framed by the pale glow of a bedside monitor, was Shin Ara. She looked fragile against the stark white sheets, her hair damp with sweat and her face drained of its usual vibrant color. When she turned her head toward the sound of his entrance, her eyes, wide and glazed with pain, locked onto his. Even through the surgical mask and the doctor's disguise, she knew him. The recognition was instantaneous, a visceral pull that 7 months of bitter silence hadn't managed to sever. Wu Jin. Her voice was a ragged whisper, trembling with a mix of disbelief and an agonizing relief that cut deeper than any blade. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his composure finally shattering. He pulled the mask from his face, revealing the sharp, tortured lines of a man who had spent half a year pretending he was whole without her. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he reached out, his calloused hand trembling as he took hers. Ara gripped him with a strength that startled him, her knuckles turning white as another contraction rolled through her body. "You came," she choked out, a single tear escaping to track through the salt and grit on her cheek. "I didn't think. I didn't know if I should call, but there was no one else, Wu Jin. No one I could trust." His gaze dropped then, moving from her face to the unmistakable swell beneath the hospital gown. The reality hit him like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a legacy. A life created in the final, desperate embers of a marriage he thought had been extinguished by a divorce of lies. 7 months, Ara, he murmured, his voice thick and dangerously low. He sank to his knees beside the bed, the feared boss of the Seoul Underworld suddenly small in the shadow of her pain. "You carried this alone. Why?" "To keep him safe," she breathed, her eyes searching his for a spark of the man she used to know, the one who wasn't covered in the blood of his enemies. "I thought if you didn't know, the shadows wouldn't find him, but I was wrong. I'm scared, Wu Jin." He pressed her hand to his forehead, closing his eyes. The weight of his hidden empire felt like lead, but the heat of her skin was the only thing that mattered. "Don't be," he swore, the ice returning to his blood, fueled now by a father's primal fury. "No one touches you. No one touches my son." The monitor beside the bed began to chirp, a frantic, rhythmic warning that sliced through the heavy silence of room 428. Ara's grip on Wu Jin's hand tightened until her fingernails drew blood, her body arching as a fresh wave of agony took hold. "Wu Jin, something's wrong," she gasped, her breath hitching in a way that made his heart stutter. He didn't look at the screen, he looked at her. "Breathe, Ara, just look at me." He kept his voice a low, melodic anchor, the same tone he used to command a room of 100 armed men, now distilled into a singular lifeline for the woman he loved. Just then, the subtle vibration of the radio at his waist hummed against his hip. A double click. Then a third. It was the signal from Kim on the floor below. Contact. The rival factions had tracked the Emperor to his most vulnerable coordinate. Somewhere beneath their feet in the sterile labyrinth of the hospital's lower levels, a silent war had begun. The muffled thud of a body hitting a tiled floor and the hiss of a suppressed discharge echoed through the ventilation, sounds invisible to the nursing staff but screamingly loud to a man like Wu Jin. "The doctor! Where is the doctor?" Ara cried out, her eyes clouded with a sudden primal terror as the room began to swarm with medical staff reacting to the alarm. Wu Jin didn't flinch. He leaned over her, his broad shoulders shielding her from the chaos of the room and the violence rising from the elevator banks. He was a wall of teal scrubs and iron will. "I am here," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers, his scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain grounding her. "The world ends at that door, Ara. Inside this room there is only you and our child. Do you hear me? I won't let the shadows in." Outside, the silhouette of a man in a black suit drifted past the frosted glass of the door, a hand reaching into a jacket, only to be intercepted by Kim's shadow. A brief, violent struggle flickered like a silent film against the glass before both figures vanished. "Push, Ara," the head nurse commanded, oblivious to the war in the hallway. Wu Jin's hand never wavered, even as his ears tracked the retreating footsteps of his enforcers handling the situation. He was a man holding a gun in his mind and a miracle in his hands, as the first cry of his daughter finally broke the tension, piercing the air with a raw, beautiful defiance. The radio at his hip clicked once. Clear. The underworld had tried to take his legacy before it even breathed. They had failed. As the nurse placed a small, squalling weight against Ara's chest, Wu Jin felt the last of his cold armor shatter. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a father with a world to burn. The adrenaline of the delivery had barely begun to ebb when Wu Jin stepped out into the shadowed hallway. The air was colder here, away from the warmth of Ara's skin and the soft, rhythmic breathing of his newborn daughter. Kim was waiting by the elevators, his knuckles bruised and his chest heaving slightly, holding a sleek, encrypted tablet. "The intruders were handled, boss," Kim whispered, his voice a low rasp that didn't disturb the sleeping ward. "But we found something on their lead. Communications that shouldn't exist." Wu Jin took the device, his eyes scanning the decrypted logs. As he scrolled, the sterile hospital walls seemed to close in. The messages were dated 8 months ago, weeks before the divorce papers had appeared on his desk. They weren't from a rival syndicate in Incheon or a stray mole in Gangnam. They were from Park Sang-ho, his right-hand man, the architect of his empire's expansion. The betrayal was written in cold, digital ink. Sang-ho had fed Ara fabricated evidence of Wu Jin's infidelity and a staged plan to eliminate her to protect the organization's image. He had weaponized her love and her fear, knowing she would flee to protect herself, and as he discovered, the child she was secretly carrying. The goal had been surgical: isolate Wu Jin, drown him in a grief-fueled rage that would make him reckless, and then step into the power vacuum left behind. "He made her believe I was the monster she always feared I'd become," Wu Jin murmured, the tablet cracking under the sudden, violent pressure of his grip. Every moment of the last 7 months, the hollow ache in his chest, the nights spent drinking himself into a stupor, the way Ara had looked at him in room 428 with a mixture of love and bone-deep terror, had been choreographed by the man he called brother. Sang-ho hadn't just attacked his territory. He had dismantled his soul for a seat at the head of a table that didn't even belong to him yet. A dark, predatory calm settled over Wu Jin. The impossible gentleness he had shown Ara moments ago vanished, replaced by the lethal clarity that had made him the most feared man in Seoul. He handed the broken tablet back to Kim. "Sang-ho thinks I'm distracted by a ghost and a memory," Wu Jin said, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "He doesn't realize I finally have something worth killing for. Secure the floor. We're moving them to the mountain estate at dawn. And find Sang-ho. I want him alive long enough to realize that the man who lost everything just found his reason to burn the world down." The transfer began before the sun could touch the peaks of Buckhanson. Under the cover of a false ambulance and a 4-car motorcade of black SUVs, Wu Jin moved his world. Ara lay in the back of the lead vehicle, her pale face illuminated by the rhythmic passing of streetlights, her arms locked around the small, swaddled bundle that was now the center of Wu Jin's universe. He sat across from her, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, his eyes never leaving the glass. The city of Seoul fell away, replaced by the winding, jagged ascent into the mountains. Here, tucked behind ancient stone walls and high-tech biometric gates, sat the Wu Jin family estate, a traditional Hanok fortress that had been in his bloodline long before he had traded honor for the shadow wars of Gangnam. It was a place designed for a king, but today it was a sanctuary for a father. As the heavy iron gates groaned shut behind them, the silence of the mountain air felt heavy, expectant. The estate's courtyard was swarming with his most loyal men, their silhouettes sharp against the gray dawn, rifles held at the low ready. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were the garrison of a man who had declared war on his own shadow. "We're safe here, Ara," Wu Jin murmured, helping her from the car with a tenderness that seemed alien in the presence of so much steel. He guided her into the master suite, where the scent of aged cedar and floor-heated warmth rose to meet them. Ara looked around the vast, fortified room, her eyes finally losing the jagged edge of the hospital's terror. "You've turned your home into a cage, Wu Jin." "No," he corrected, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he looked out the window toward the valley below, where Sang-ho's reach ended and his own absolute authority began. "I've turned it into a grave for anyone who thinks they can touch you." He watched her settle onto the thick silk bedding, the baby letting out a soft, contented sigh. For a fleeting second, the Emperor felt a pang of something he hadn't known in years: peace. But it was a fragile thing, a glass ornament held in a fist of iron. He knew the architect of lies was out there, calculating his next move. Sang-ho wouldn't stop until he had tested these walls. Woo-jin stepped back into the hallway, his face hardening as he met Kim's gaze. The transition had begun. The mountain was secure, the perimeter was locked, and the war was no longer about territory. It was about blood. The mountain air was a razor against Woo-jin's skin as he stepped onto the stone veranda. He had traded the teal scrubs for a tactical black overcoat, the weight of a customized Sig Sauer reassuring against his ribs. Below, the valley was a sea of charcoal mist, but his mind was fixed on a single coordinate, a private club in Gangnam where Park Sang-ho was likely celebrating a victory that hadn't yet been won. "They think you're mourning," Kim said, appearing like a shadow at his shoulder. "They think you're trapped by the woman and the child." Woo-jin checked the slide of his weapon, the metallic clack echoing through the courtyard. "Let them think I'm a father. They've forgotten I'm a predator." The operation didn't move with the blunt force of a gang war. It moved with the surgical precision of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. 4 black sedans glided down the mountain road, a funeral procession for a betrayal. By the time they reached the neon-soaked streets of the city, Woo-jin's heartbeat had slowed to a steady, lethal rhythm. The breach was silent. His men moved through the club's service entrance like smoke, neutralizing the perimeter guards before a single alarm could trip. When Woo-jin kicked open the doors to the private lounge, Sang-ho was mid-sentence, a glass of expensive scotch frozen halfway to his lips. The look of pure, unadulterated terror that washed over the architect's face was more intoxicating than any drink. "Woo-jin, you shouldn't be here," Sang-ho stammered, his calculated composure shattering. "The hospital, the baby. You used my family as a distraction, Sang-ho," Woo-jin said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate the glass on the tables. He didn't rush. He walked toward his former partner with the deliberate pace of an executioner. "You made her run. You made her fear the man who would die for her. That is a debt you cannot pay in one." Sang-ho reached for a hidden holster, but Woo-jin was faster, not with a bullet, but with a strike that sent the other man spiraling into a mahogany desk. He pinned Sang-ho by the throat, the strength of his grip fueled by 7 months of hollow silence. "I'm not here for my empire," Woo-jin whispered into Sang-ho's ear as his men systematically dismantled the rest of the traitors in the room. "I'm here to make sure my daughter never grows up in a world where men like you exist." He didn't look away when the debt was finally collected. As he stepped back out into the cold Seoul night, the air felt different. The shadows were still there, but for the first time, they were no longer his masters. He had a family to return to and a legacy to burn clean. The blood on Woo-jin's hands was easy to wash away, but the stain on his name required a different kind of labor. In the weeks following the purge, the Emperor of Gangnam did something far more terrifying to his enemies than ordering a hit. He began to divest. The process of cleaning, an empire built on shadows, was not a sudden pivot but a slow, excruciating extraction, like pulling shards of glass from a wound. He started with the ports. The shadowy warehouses in Incheon, once the gateways for illicit cargo, were systematically liquidated or transitioned into legitimate logistics hubs. He didn't just sell the assets. He burned the ledgers. One by one, the protection rackets were dissolved, replaced by a legitimate security firm that hired the men who were willing to trade their street thug reputations for a steady paycheck and a sense of duty. Ara watched him from the nursery of the mountain estate, her skepticism slowly softening into a tentative hope. She saw him not in tailored suits or surgical disguises, but in the quiet moments of the dawn, hunched over stacks of legal contracts and transition papers. He was dismantling the world he had spent 15 years building, stone by stone, for a daughter who was currently small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. "It will take years," he told her one evening, his voice weary as he watched their daughter Jaya sleep. "The underworld doesn't let go easily. They see legitimacy as a weakness." "And is it?" Ara asked, stepping closer, the scent of the mountain pines clinging to her hair. Woo-jin reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate line of his daughter's hand. "It's the greatest strength I've ever had. I spent my life making people fear me so I could survive. Now I'm making them respect me so she can live." The transformation was fraught with danger. Every clean deal was a target for those who preferred the old ways, and every legitimate board meeting was a battlefield where Wu Jin had to use his sharp-edged intellect instead of his Glock. But he was relentless. He funneled his vast, tainted wealth into foundations and urban renewal projects across Seoul, burying the sins of the father under the infrastructure of the future. He was no longer just a boss. He was an architect of a different kind. He was building a fortress not of stone and iron, but of law and legacy. As the months bled into a year, the name Young Woo-jin began to appear in the financial papers rather than the police blotters. He was becoming a man his daughter could look at without having to turn her head away from the shadows. The debt was being paid, not in blood, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life redeemed. The tea house was tucked away in a quiet corner of Jongno, a relic of an older Seoul where wood and stone outlasted neon and steel. Inside, the air smelled of scorched rice and ancient dust. Young Woo-jin sat cross-legged on the tatami mat, his back perfectly straight, facing Elder O, a man whose influence was a ghost that still haunted the foundations of the city's underworld. In the old days, Woo-jin would have arrived with a dozen armed men and a message of blood. Today he came alone, unarmed, carrying only the weight of his new conviction. Between them sat a low table and a steaming pot of tea, the silence stretching until it became a physical pressure. "You are throwing away a kingdom for a lullaby, Woo-jin," the elder finally spoke, his voice like dry parchment. His eyes, clouded by age but sharp with a predatory wisdom, scanned Woo-jin's face for a flicker of regret. "The others see your cleaning as an insult. They say you've grown soft in the mountain air. Let them say it," Woo-jin replied, his voice a calm, steady resonance. He poured the tea with a hand that did not shake. "Softness is for those who have nothing to protect. I am here because I have everything. I'm not asking for permission to leave the circle, Elder. I'm informing you that the circle no longer includes me." The elder leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening in the creases of his face. "And if the circle decides to close in on you, on the woman, on the child who bears your name," Woo-jin set the porcelain cup down with a soft, final click, "then they will learn why I was the one who survived the transition when so many others became memories. I have dismantled my empire, but I have not forgotten how to dismantle men. If peace is broken, I will return to the old ways, not for territory, but for an ending. I will burn every bridge until there is nowhere left for any of you to hide." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, delivered with the cold, absolute certainty of a man who had stared into the abyss and decided he preferred the light. The elder watched him for a long moment, searching for a lie and finding only the ironclad resolve of a father. Slowly, the older man picked up his cup and took a sip, a silent acknowledgement of terms. The debt of the past was being stayed, not by a contract of gold, but by a treaty of mutual destruction. "Go back to your mountain, Woo-jin," the elder murmured, looking back at the steam rising from his tea. "The shadows will stay back, for now." Woo-jin bowed, a gesture of respect for a world he was finally leaving behind. He stepped out into the crisp evening air, the weight on his shoulders lifting with every step he took toward the car that would take him home. The war was over. The peace was bought. 10 years had transformed Seoul National University Hospital from a place of desperate shadows into a sanctuary of light. As the black sedan pulled up to the entrance, there were no trailing SUVs, no silent perimeters of men in dark suits. There was only the quiet hum of a spring afternoon and the warmth of a hand sliding into Woo-jin's. He looked at Aura, and for a moment the decade vanished. She was as radiant as the day he had first seen her, though the frantic terror of that 3:12 a.m. phone call had been replaced by a serene, enduring grace. Beside her, 10-year-old Jaya peered out the window, her eyes, the same sharp, intelligent eyes as her father, full of curiosity. "Is this really where it happened?" Jaya asked, her voice bright and untroubled. "This is where everything began," Woo-jin replied, his voice a low, warm rumble. He stepped out of the car, no longer a ghost in surgical scrubs, but a man standing tall in the sunlight. He wore a simple linen suit, his posture relaxed, the predatory tension that once defined him smoothed away by years of peace. They walked through the lobby, passing the same corridors where Wu Jin had once navigated a silent war. He stopped momentarily at the elevators, his gaze drifting toward the maternity ward where he had first held his daughter while a conspiracy burned outside the door. The Emperor of Gangnam was a legend now, a story whispered by old men in tea houses, but the man standing here was something far more powerful, a husband, a father, and a legitimate pillar of the city he once ruled from the dark. They reached the private wing, but they weren't here to look back. They were here for a new beginning. Ara leaned against him, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. The news of the second pregnancy had felt like a final benediction, a sign that the shadows had truly retreated, leaving room for a life that didn't need to be hidden in a mountain fortress. "You're thinking about that night," Ara whispered, her eyes searching his. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am that I answered the phone," Wu Jin murmured, leaning down to press a kiss to her temple. As they entered the consultant's office for their checkup, Wu Jin caught his reflection in the glass. The sharp features were still there, the controlled power still hummed beneath the surface, but the violence was gone. He had traded an empire for a family, and as he watched Jaya laugh at a joke the nurse made, he knew it was the only deal that ever mattered. The debt was paid, the past was buried, and the future was finally, beautifully their own.